Dr. Jordan B. Peterson's Beyond Order 12 More Rules for Life Tour. During tonight's audio and flash photography is prohibited, and we have a strict zero tolerance policy for any heckling or disruption.
Čuo sam u Petersu da jedino kakav je upravo da je valjda Vipilja jedan uletao te frekvencije što koristi bezučni mikrofon. Koji je bez mikrofon. Ja sam ovako mjesto da znaju da stoje likovi s strane da te izbaci ako ti kreneš da slikaš, da pričaš.
Hello, Belgrade. So cool. So we're very happy to be here. Thank you guys so much for coming. I'm only going to be here for a couple of minutes. Jordan and I are going to sit on the stage and we're going to do a 90-minute Q&A. You guys have put in quite a few questions off Slido, and Jordan has gone through them and chosen some that he'd like to answer. And so that has been something we've been experimenting with the number of shows, and people have really enjoyed it, so we hope that you enjoy it as well. Two things that I'd like to mention are some behind-the-scenes businesses that are going on. One of them isn't so behind the scenes anymore. My son Julian just launched an app called Essay.app, teaching people to write based on Jordan's teaching when he was teaching psychology and had students in the class that couldn't write. He had them do one essay 3 times over during the semester, and then he formalized the methods that he used to teach them how to write, and that has been developed into an app that will be changing and developing over time. But it helps you put down an outline and draft and then edit at the sentence level, the paragraph level, move sentences around and paragraphs around. So it's all programmed into that app, so hopefully that'll be helpful to everyone. The next thing is my daughter Michaela is gathering professors who are going to record 8-hour lectures online with something called Peterson Academy in the fall. And this will hopefully have accreditation for people, but it'll be professors who are speaking from Cambridge and Oxford and Stanford and MIT so far in a variety of disciplines, and there will be no ideological content allowed. No, encouraged anyway. So this is it. George's going to come out here. We spent a lot of years sitting on the couch together, me listening mostly and Jordan talking, and so I really enjoy this, to be up here with him, so I'm very grateful to be here. And with that, I'd like to announce Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
Thank you for coming. I'm looking forward to this. It's very nice to be here. Your city looks good. We were out at the fortress just before the show. That was quite the place. So it's very good to be here. And away we go.
First question. What can you do when you cannot rely on your inner compass anymore?
Yeah, that's a rough question. What can you do when you can't rely on your inner compass anymore? There's an idea that's expressed in the Gospels that there's one sin that you cannot be forgiven for, and that's the sin against the Holy Spirit. And that has been associated in theological thought with the action of conscience. So conscience is a very strange phenomenon because it seems in some sense independent of us. If you betray yourself, which you can apparently do, then part of you objects to that. Maybe it objects in the middle of the night. Maybe it makes it difficult for you to sleep because you torture yourself. Or something in you tortures you, which seems to be a more accurate description. Because if it's you, the part you have voluntary control over, that's torturing you, well, why can't you just stop? People like Freud, when they were thinking about the conscience, thought about it as the internalization of the social structure, that would be the superego, and therefore is something that was fundamentally learned. And there's definitely some truth in that we are historical creatures, and a lot of who we are is a consequence of the culture we've grown up in and what we were taught. But there's obviously a biological proclivity to have something like a conscience develop, because it appears to be essentially universal. And it's not reasonable to assume that it's merely a consequence of socialization. Virtually nothing is, and there's no reason to assume that something as fundamental as conscience is merely a social construct. There's all sorts of reasons for assuming the opposite. One being, for example, the probable existence of something like a natural ethos or a natural law that governs complex social interactions. And so the conscience then would be a psychological phenomena, a spirit, a pattern of action and behavior and perception that enables you to deviate, to detect and correct deviations from the path of optimal psychological health and social integration. So it's an instinct for positioning. And a lot of that conscience is your inner compass, let's say. And the compass is an interesting idea, because a compass points north. And the reason that we use north as the fundamental point of orientation is because north is associated with the North Star. And the North Star is the closest thing that we can see in the sky to a fixed point of reference. So the North Star is in alignment with the Earth's axis, so it doesn't move when the Earth moves, and so it's a constant point of reference. And so the compass points north. That gives you a constant point of reference. That means you can orient yourself in the world, you can navigate, and the conscience, the inner compass, points unerringly also. It points unerringly to the axis, the mythological axis that unites earth with heaven. That's Jack's beanstalk, by the way, which is an unbelievably old idea. Who knows, 150,000 years old. Incredibly old idea. Part of the shamanic tradition. That there's something that unites us with what's transcendent, that guides us unerringly. And so this is a deep question. What happens when you can no longer trust your own inner compass? That's the worst thing that can happen to you. Imagine that you have corrupted yourself or become corrupt to such a degree that the fundamental instinct that orients you in the world is no longer reliable. I don't believe there's anything worse that can happen to you. And that's why I think the gospel statement that the sin against the Holy Ghost is one that cannot be forgiven is psychologically accurate. Now, you might ask, well, how would it be that that inner voice becomes corrupted? And the answer to that seems to be that it's a consequence of lying. And so, if you start doing something new, so for example, if the experiment that was done that I remember on this topic was that a number of people were put inside an MRI scanner, functional MRI scanner, which can detect brain activity, not just structure. And they were Danish language speakers who listened to Danish played to them either forward or backwards. And if it was played forward, so they understood it, only a small part of their brain in the back part of the left hemisphere was active. But when it was backwards, huge portions of both cortices were active, much more metabolically demanding. It's much more metabolically demanding to do something you haven't done before. And it's because you don't know how to do it, and you have to build up the ability to do that. You have to build up the musculature and the neurological circuitry, and you have to dispense with what's extraneous and excess. And the way that manifests itself physiologically is that you build an increasingly specialized neurological system, and those tend to reside in the back half of the left hemisphere. And so, for example, you have very specialized neurons. Once you're an expert reader for detecting words, they've discovered neurons as specific as grandmother neurons, and a single neuron that'll fire when you see a picture of your grandmother. There's probably more than one that does that, but that's how specialized it can be, that practice of perception. And so what you do when you practice is you build dedicated automated machinery to undertake a task. And that machinery starts to operate in a somewhat deterministic manner. And the advantage to that is that it's extremely fast and automatic. And so that by the time you're an expert reader, you have modules for identified letters and syllables and words and whole phrases. And maybe if you're a fantastically expert reader, you have specialized circuits to identify whole sentences. And so you're automatizing the ability from the bottom up. And you do that by building specialized neurological machinery. So now imagine what happens if you lie to yourself habitually. Well, the first time you do it, it's difficult and effortful, and it occupies a lot of neurological territory and activity. But as you practice it, you build a specialized machine that thinks that way and sees that way and acts that way, and those machines, in some sense, can become connected by the spirit of deception, and then you can automate that so that it starts to run more and more automatically. And as it does so, it gains the ability to inhibit other competing possibilities. And so if you practice to lie, then you build a machine within you that's best conceptualized as a personality based on lies that then can inhibit your conscience. And if you do that long enough, you're in real trouble. We know, for example, if like addiction works that way too, is addiction will facilitate the development of the circuitry, for example, that leads to drug-seeking behavior. Addicts sometimes talk about having a monkey on their back, but really what they have is a drug-seeking machine, drug-seeking spirit in their mind, in their brain. And maybe you start to break the addiction, but you don't get rid of that old machine. The best you can do is build a new machine to inhibit that one. And so then it's always there still. And then the problem is that if you get stressed, the stress tends to interfere more effectively with the newer machine than the old one. And so often people will relapse when they're stressed. And you see this in your own behavior, is that maybe you think you've matured out of something, but then you get stressed or tired even, and you go back to that old pattern of behavior. It's not just some, vague, disembodied spirit that inhabits you. It's encoded into your neural machinery. And so this is one of the things that's very useful to know if you want to motivate yourself to stop lying. Because if you practice to deceive, that's who you build yourself into. And you might say, well, so what? As long as I can get away with my lies, who cares if I've made it automated? And the right response to that is, yeah, one day you're going to run into a real complicated problem. And the only thing that might have saved you from it would be that internal compass that could have guided you through. And if you've built a whole personality based on lies that's capable of competitively inhibiting the function of that internal compass, then when push comes to shove, you're going to be lost. And it's really worth thinking that through, because I've seen this many, many times in people's lives where they hit a crisis, and because they have been tempted into programming themselves inappropriately, they make a mistake at a critical moment, or 5 critical moments, or 50 critical moments, and they're in hell. And it's very, 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 very difficult to get out. So the reason that you don't want to lie is because if you practice to lie, you build the personality of the spirit that deceives inside your psyche at a biological level, at a level of psychological reality as well. And then you're under the sway of the thing that you've allowed to be built within you, that you've allowed in, that you've entered into a relationship with. And heaven help you, because nothing else will once that happens. So then on the practical side, if you find yourself in a situation where it is difficult for you to rely on your internal compass because you've become corrupted or been enticed into that, or allowed yourself to have that happen, or been tempted, succumb to the temptation to allow that to happen, then what you can start doing is, that's classic religious transformation essentially, to repent, to identify what it is that you've done wrong, to think through how you went wrong, to swear that you will stop doing that, and then to stop doing it. And then you can practice putting yourself straight again. And I think the easiest way to start doing that is to make the decision that you are no longer going to say things that you know to be lies and do things that you know to be false. We all are not infallible in our ability to distinguish between truth and falsehood. And so this is why when I wrote a rule about telling the truth in my first book, I said, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Because telling the truth that's an extraordinarily difficult task, because it assumes that first that you know the truth, that's pretty difficult, and second that you're put together enough to actually utter it properly, and that's an extraordinarily demanding goal, let's say. But we all know that we say things that we know to be false. And we all know that some of those things that we know to be false that we say, we decided to say and could have done differently. We could have decided not to do it. When you hit a choice point like that, you think, well, this way or this way. And you think, yeah, it'll be easier. I can get away with it. I'll get what I want. What difference does it make? I'll just manipulate or act instrumentally or lie or hide things. And you can stop doing that. And you should. Because it's very dangerous to do that. It's a pathway to arrogance and to catastrophe. If you stop doing that, then you get better and better at not doing it. You get able to make finer and finer distinctions between what's true and what isn't. And maybe if you practice that long enough, instead of just not lying, you can also start telling the truth. And then you can start to live in the truth. And then when that happens, you can rely on your inner compass, and then you can find your proper orientation in the world. And that's a hell of a thing to give up just for the trivial advantages that in the short term that living a life of deception can offer. And then I would say you can also consider this on a broader scale. The deepest commentators that I've had the privilege to read on topics associated, let's say, with the temptation of totalitarian tyranny, lay out clearly the hypothesis that tyranny exists at the social level in precise proportion to the willingness of the people who constitute the tyranny to lie. And so what a tyranny is a collective decision on the part of everyone, virtually, to lie about virtually everything, virtually all the time. And out of that you get the terrible jokes that the Soviets used to tell, like, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. And that's no basis for a functional society, that's for sure. And so not only is it extraordinarily dangerous psychologically to say things that you know to be untrue or to do things that you know to be false. It's a terrible, terrible medium to long-term strategy. But it's also the direct pathway to the construction of social organizations that are not only tyrannical, but that are willing to commit atrocity in the service of the maintenance of the deception. So, if you can no longer rely on your inner compass, then you should stop lying. And then pray that your vision clears before you walk off the edge of a cliff. So, yeah.
So, yeah.
This question is about how not to lose yourself during immigration. And there's a little story after it. It says, my family had to leave our home in Russia when the war started, which led to depression of all, including the kids.
Yeah, well, if you immigrate, especially involuntarily, then you're going to lose yourself, because a lot of what yourself is distributed into your community. And so when you decide to leave somewhere voluntarily, you usually have a new plan in place, and you've made arrangements already to replace some of the things that you had around you, like your job and your community. You know, if you move to a new city, you generally don't just go there riding the rails because you have to. You generally go there because you've sought out a job and you have a place to live. And so you've already put in place some of the containing social structures that actually constitute your sanity. You know, modern people tend to think of their sanity as something that's inside them. You know, it's a function of their autonomous soul. But that's not a very sophisticated view, because some of your sanity is dependent on the integration of your various beliefs and your motivational systems and your emotions. So you're not a mass of internal contradictions, but a lot of your sanity, and we can define sanity as your ability to control negative emotion, your ability to experience positive emotion, and your ability to keep your thoughts coherent, consistent, and functional. That's not a bad definition of sanity. A lot of that is dependent on your positioning in a social environment. So if you have a good marriage, then your wife or husband helps keep you sane when they're not driving you insane, and usually by pointing out your faults. Your children, your relationship with your children, that helps keep you sane because they call on you to be responsible, and that call to responsibility, and they punish you if you're not. That call to responsibility helps organize you. And then you have reciprocal relationships with your friends, and they tap you into place, you know, by not laughing at your jokes when you're not funny, and by paying attention to you when you're acting in a manner that's reciprocal and appropriate. And the same thing applies in the workplace, and then with the broader community and the state. And when you are forced out of your community, you lose all that superordinate social structure that literally helps you maintain to regulate your negative emotion because you're not unhappy and anxious and lonesome, and to experience some positive emotion because you have people to interact with and play with and joke with and talk with, and to exchange ideas with, so that your thinking doesn't get too twisted and deviant in whatever direction you're prone to become twisted and deviant in, and that all gets blown up when you are forced out of your community. And so you might think, well, this insanity that you feel as a consequence is in you, but it's not. It's a consequence of much being broken in your life. And so that's the first thing to understand, is that that's an entirely likely response, especially if it happened involuntarily. So then the question is, well, what do you do about it? And my wife and I have moved a lot in our lives to radically different places, sometimes linguistically different places, not, I wouldn't say in a manner that is as shocking as having to leave as a war refugee, but we still shifted countries and locales many times. And one of the things we learned to do when moving to a new city was to establish some repetitive habits very quickly. And so, part of the reason you feel at home somewhere is because there's 10,000 things you know. You know where to get your mail. You know where to pick up a prescription. You know where to lock your bike. You know the routes to work. You know where the parks are. And everything you know is something that helps you regulate your anxiety. You know what it's like when you go to a new city, even as a tourist, and you have to find a route to a park and then back to the hotel. There's some adventure associated with that, but there's some anxiety because you don't know where you're going, and so you could get lost. And so there's many ways you could walk to the park, maybe 1,000, but only one of them are right. And so to begin with, you're confronted with 1,000 ways you could do it, and that makes you anxious. That's an entropy response. Then you have to collapse that into the single solution. And a lot of what keeps you not anxious in a place you know, the familiarity literally is that you know what behaviors to manifest to get what you want without any complexity. And there's thousands and thousands of those pieces of knowledge when you're at home somewhere. Even within your own apartment or house, you know the details of, you could walk around in the dark, let's say. And so you're familiar there, and that keeps your anxiety under control, because partly what anxiety does is indicate the presence of the unfamiliar. So one thing you can do when you move to a new city, one of the things we did, for example, when we moved to Toronto, which was about 20 years ago now, we started to go to we found this little bar/restaurant that was a block from our new apartment, and it didn't have great food, but it was pretty fun. We liked the people that owned it. They were quite friendly when we came in, and there were a lot of students who hung out there, and there was a karaoke machine and some pinball machines. It was kind of a ratty place, so it was really comfortable. And, it wasn't so shiny and new that you were the ugliest thing in the whole building, and which is something that people really hate. You don't want to be the ugliest thing in the whole building. That's not good. That's not good for you. So we just went there. We went there every Friday, and as I said, the food wasn't great, and so perhaps we could have made something better along those dimensions. But that anchored one part of our life, right? So it was like Friday at 5 o'clock to 8:30, we had a routine, and that was something we did without fail. And that was a place that anxiety was no longer manifest because it was fixed and familiar. And what you want to do when you move somewhere new is to build blocks of repetitive familiarity. And that keeps anxiety under control because it controls entropy. This is something that's very important to know about children. So many parents are loath to put constraints on their children, disciplinary constraints, let's say, because they feel that the child should have as much possibility as possible, and that all constraints are inhibitory and tyrannical in some sense, maybe because they interfere with the creative expression of of your child. And children are wells of possibility. And it is the case that as they're socialized, they're also constrained. And so there's some truth in that. But what that viewpoint is missing is that children actually don't like unconstrained possibility any more than adults do. So imagine that you have a 3-year-old and you're trying to get the 3-year-old dressed in the morning and you want to allow him some choice because you're a big believer in choice. Maybe you'll even let him pick his gender, for example. Or worse is sex, which means you've definitely 100% gone too far. And so imagine there's a closet and the kid has a lot of clothes in the closet and you say pick out something to wear and you find the child gets quite upset and gets whiny and is uncooperative and you don't know why, and the answer is he doesn't want to make 50 decisions to get dressed. It's too much. So there's a huge consumer literature on this. So imagine you have a shelf here that has 200 shampoos on it, and you have a shelf here that has 5 shampoos on it, 5 different brands. Then you let people go to pick a shampoo from the 200 brand shelf or from the 5 brand shelf, 2 different groups of people. And then you ask them how satisfied they are with their purchase. And you might think, well, the people who had the larger choice would be more satisfied because, well, they had 200 to choose from and what a variety, and so they got the best shampoo. But what you find is the people who had a choice from 5 are more satisfied. And the reason for that is, well, are you a shampoo expert? And the answer is no. And so what's the probability that you pick the right shampoo from a range of 200? And the answer is 1 in 200. And that's just not a very good chance. Whereas if it's 5, 1 in 5, which is a lot better. And so all that choice, that's an entropy problem. It's too many selections. You know, I never liked going to sandwich shops where they allow you 50 choices. It's like, I'm actually paying you to make me a sandwich. If I have to decide everything that goes on the sandwich, I might as well just make the sandwich. Maybe I want 5 options, you know, chicken, pork, beef, maybe a vegetarian option, probably not. Vegan, definitely not. So maybe with your 3-year-old, what you do is you take 3 outfits from the closet and you lay them on the bed and you say, pick one. And then the kid's pretty happy because, you know, he or she got a choice. And then they deal with a bit of possibility, but they're not overwhelmed by the degrees of freedom. And you don't want to overwhelm your children with degrees of freedom. What you want to do, this is why paradise is a walled garden. A garden is a place of possibility and natural potential. But it's a garden, which means it's tended and regulated, and it's walled, which means that much of what could be is not there, because if everything was there, that would be too much. And so around your children, you set up walled gardens that are quite small to begin with, because your children are small, and then you move the walls back as they mature, and maybe by the time they're 18 or 40, you knock the walls down and they leave, right? And then they go set up their own walled gardens because they're just as good at it at that point as you are. So you can't do that for them anymore. But a huge part of what you do, it's so important to understand this, is that when you set up predictable and regular routines with children, and help them abide by those routines, you're stabilizing, especially if those routines repeat every day, you're stabilizing huge chunks of their experience and decreasing the entropy that's associated with those experiences. Now, so maybe you want to have a bedtime that's pretty consistent and a routine around that, you know, at 7:30, you find a book. At 7:45, we read a book, or maybe 2 books. At 8 o'clock, you wash your face and you brush your teeth and you get a pat and you get tucked into bed. And maybe, once every week you get to have 2 books, because you want to have a little play in the system, right? A little, but not that much. And then you've nailed down bedtime. And everyone knows what to expect, and then maybe you and your wife can go have some privacy, so you don't hate your damn kid for being there 100% of the time, because you certainly will. And then you shouldn't be thinking, well, that's a arbitrary, constraint on the noble savagery of the child. It's not that at all. You're doing the child a favor by specifying and regulating chunks of the time and space that they occupy. And so you want to nail down those routines. You want to do a fair bit of that in your own life, depending on your tolerance for ambiguity and novelty. Some people tolerate more and some people tolerate less. And then within those constraints, you can play with variability. And a good way of thinking about that is the way that musicians play with the rules of music. There are rules, and music has to be quite predictable. If it's not predictable at all, it's just noise. If it's too predictable, it's dull. What you want is predictability with optimized variation, and that's what you want in your household. And you can tell if you have that because it's playful. That's the best way to note that that's occurring. Play generally occurs in a rule-governed framework, but there's enough leeway so that there's some exploration and growth allowed. And if you set up your routines optimally, then they have that rule-governed structure with allowance for deviance and play. And so if you are thrown out of your house and you're in a new country, then you want to nail down some routines as fast as you can and repeat them. You want to nail down things that repeat day to day, week to week, as fast as you can. You can modify them later, I think we went to this restaurant for about 1.5 years, and then the university shut it down because students were having fun there, and that wasn't allowed at the University of Toronto. So, because who needs a social life, And then we went and I think we found another, I think it was a Greek restaurant that we used to go to on Friday nights that basically had the same role. And everyone looked forward to that. We all knew what was going to happen. We could all agree to be there. And because we all knew what was going to happen, and we had all agreed to be there and repeated, there was no stress associated with it. And that, because it was low stress and didn't provoke anxiety, it meant that other things could happen that were, at least, if not fun, at least calm. We did this on Friday nights because once we had got accustomed to being in Toronto, because I had a clinical day on Friday. I usually worked for 13 hours in a row doing clinical work, and by the time I was done that, I couldn't even listen to a sentence anymore. And so we found we were fighting if we were at home on Friday night, because everybody's tempers were frayed, mine included, if we stayed home and made our own food and all of that. And so we started going to this restaurant. And that worked but the rule was you couldn't say anything that was longer than a sentence to me. At least not until I had eaten and relaxed a bit. But that worked very well. And we did that quite repetitively for, I would think, about 3 years, I think, something like that. So that's what I would recommend if you get displaced, is get those micro routines that repeat daily, nailed down as fast as you can, because that's really the cornerstone of your sanity. And you can talk that over with your wife and your kids, get up at the same time, interact with your apartment the same way, that might be house cleaning or whatever, get the routines down, as many as you can, and stay within them. And you'll start to see that you start to get stable. You probably want to get so many routines in place that you start to get bored. Because boredom is an indication that there are now too many routines. So fine, that's your goal. Bored beats depressed. And then once you hit bored, you can start to vary a bit until you find that optimal balance again. So good luck with your move, your forced move. That's rough, man. And lots of people are going to be experiencing that again right now. So, yeah.
How to practice
back a bit. It's harder on Zoom because Zoom has a bit of a lag, and so in a face-to-face conversation, it's easier to get the timing of a conversation right. On Zoom, it's a bit awkward, and I have a tendency to leap in if I think that there might be a lag space or if I get enthusiastic. I'm very extroverted and very verbally fluent, and so whenever I listen to someone, I have questions that are just popping up in my head like mad, and I have a hard time not asking them. That aside, I know one really good technique for listening, and I learned this from Carl Rogers. There aren't that many psychological strategies that are explicitly formulatable, that aren't just formulaic, that aren't manipulative, that are actually helpful. And this is one of them. This really works. And Rogers' work, by the way, Rogers really began group counseling back in the 60s. And a lot of his work has laid the groundwork for international peacekeeping conversations. And because Rogers was very interested in negotiation and conflict resolution, and so not only do these techniques work individual to individual, they work when mediating between the viewpoints of people who are even at war with each other, like literally at war, and they have definitely produced progress in many situations towards the cessation of conflict and the establishment of peace. So, 2 thumbs up for Carl Rogers for getting this right. He said, people generally can't listen. And the reason for that, in some sense, is the same reason for why they can't think. And you might think you think, but you probably don't. And even if you do, you probably only think halfway. So Carl Jung said, the way most people think is that a thought appears in the theater of their imagination, sort of spontaneously. It's fair, it's a mystery, right? I mean, here's a mystery. You ask yourself a question, and then you get an answer. And you might ask, well, if you could generate the answer, why did you ever have to ask the question? And who are you asking the question to? You say, well, I thought up the answer. It's like, that's not much of an explanation. It's not an explanation at all. Not even a bit. You can pose a question to yourself, and an answer will bubble up from the depths and make itself manifest. And you don't believe that most people, first of all, might not even pose the question to begin with. They just run on automatic assumption. But if they did pose the question, they'd get an answer, and then the answer would be the truth. If you can think, first of all, you open yourself up to that kind of revelation, and then what you do is you break yourself into sub-personalities who adopt different viewpoints in relationship to that idea, and then you have an internal debate about the validity of the idea. And that's actually difficult technically because it actually constitutes applied philosophy. And it's also very difficult emotionally because you have to be able to tolerate the conflict of the different personalities that are engaged in the discussion. You have to do that all inside yourself. And the deeper the problem and the more troublesome the problem, the more intense the emotion is that's associated with that. So people do a pretty damn dismal job of thinking, generally speaking. And, sorry, I need the wording of the question again, if you would.
Good luck. See if I can find it. Let me see.
Oh yes, listen. There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so
Listen.
Rogers, thank you very much. Someone was listening, and so Rogers pointed out that it was very difficult for people to listen because it was emotionally challenging. Imagine you're trying to listen to your wife or your husband, and they're different than you. They have different temperaments, so they actually see the facts differently, right? It isn't just that you have different opinions. It's way worse problem than that. And, you've staked yourself in some way on your perceptions because your perceptions are guides to your action. And if your perceptions are inaccurate, then what you do is wrong. And then if what you do is wrong, then And you realize that, then all the snakes come out because you don't know what to do. And so nobody likes having their presumptions challenged because it presents them with the problem of entropy immediately. It's like, well, I don't know what to do now. And why is that a problem? Well, because there's so many things I can do. That's no good. It's like the 3-year-old with the closet full of clothes. So if you listen to someone, it's so annoying because they'll tell you things that aren't in accordance with the way you assume things are and should be. And that makes you anxious. And that the more complex the problem you're discussing, the higher the level of anxiety. And that's partly because some of your assumptions are shallow. Hardly anything depends on them. And some of your assumptions are deep, and everything you do depends on them. And the more fundamental an assumption that's up for dispute, the more entropy can be released if the assumption is challenged. And so this is why it's much more annoying if you're driving to work. You find out you're almost out of gas. That's somewhat anxiety provoking, but you can easily fix it by filling up your car. But if your car breaks down, then that's very anxiety provoking, especially if you don't have much money, because, well, what do you know about your car? Nothing. And so as soon as it doesn't do car things, then it's not a car. It's whatever the hell it is, and you don't know what it is. It's all covered with a nice shiny shell so that you can pretend that it's a 1 pixel thing, but it's insanely complex, and as soon as it doesn't work, you're done. And then you don't know how you're going to get to work, and you don't know how your day is going to go, and you don't know if you're going to meet a mechanic who's going to screw you over because what the hell do you know about your car? Maybe it's time to get a new car, and maybe you can't afford it, and that's because your job isn't good, and maybe that's because you're useless and lazy, and then your car is broken down because you're a bad person, and it's like. So that's also what happens when you listen to someone. And so Rogers pointed out that people weren't very good at that, and it was because to listen is to risk transformation. And then you might ask yourself, well, why not stay in your comfortable rut instead of being transformed? And the answer has to be something like, because you know you're stupid. And that's humility. It's like, look, life is not perfect, and the reason it's not perfect is because I'm ignorant and sinful. I do not know what I'm doing, and I miss the mark constantly. And so the reason I'm going to listen to you, even though it's annoying, is because there might be something you know that I don't know, and then I won't have to learn it the hard way. And that's especially true when you're dealing with your wife or your husband, because you're also stuck with them, so you bloody well better listen. And so Rogers outlines why you won't listen, why you want to insist that you're right. It's also a very bad idea, especially if you're dealing with your wife or your husband, because what are you going to do, just dominate them? What if they're right, even though you don't see it? And then if you dominate them continually, then you're just going to have someone crushed as a partner. That seems like a bad idea. And you're going to interfere with their development so they won't be who they could be. And then you'll have this albatross that you created hanging around your neck. Like, it's just a bad strategy. And so, annoying as it is to listen, and it's plenty annoying, that's your best bet. And then Rogers continues in some sense and says, well, given all the reasons you have not to listen, and the fact you're not very good at it, or very good at thinking, or very good at negotiating, how do you know if you're actually listening? And this is really, I think, the genius of his realization. He said, after the person says what they have to say, so you say, please say what you have to say. I'll do my best to let you express yourself until you feel that you've covered the territory. So you have to let the person wander around, sort of casting aspersions and making mistakes and floundering about, especially if it's complicated. That's very anxiety provoking too. So you have to listen to all that. And then often, while they're doing that, they realize that a lot of what they said isn't necessary and might be wrong. And so they'll do this all by themselves. They'll sort of shrink what they're concerned about. Because they see, when they lay it out, that some of it's just old habits, and some of it's just not true, and some of it's just annoyance, but there's this core thing. And then you summarize what they told you, and you say it back to them. But the rule is they have to agree with what you said. And so that's a very good test for steel manning your opponent. And people love this. If you do this with people, they will like you right away and pretty much forever. If you do this with everyone you meet, and not just as a formula, it has to be something you learn to do in a sophisticated way. You listen to them and you say, it sounds to me like this is what you're saying. Have I got it right? And they might say, well, yes, I'm so glad you listened to me. That sometimes will just stop the fight right there. Just the fact that you actually listened, especially because lots of people have never been listened to in their whole life. And so if you listen to someone, it'll just stop them dead. They're so shocked by the fact that that happened that they just love you instantly. And you don't even have to change in that situation. Or maybe they'll say, no, you didn't get it at all. Here's what I really meant. And then, the whole painful process to go on for some more time. Or they'll correct you, but you want to get corrected until you can summarize for them what they said. And that also usually means you've compressed it, because you're not going to wander all over the same territory that they did. You're going to compact it, right? You're extracting out the gist, which is the central part of their statement. And people really like to have that reflected back to them, because it also helps them compress their concerns and simplify them and stabilize them. And so then you can get to the heart of the matter then, and you may find that there's only a few modifications that you both have to do to reach an agreement of peace. Or at least you're now talking about what matters. And the person trusts you because they've been able to express themselves, and you were able to accept what they said. That doesn't mean agree with it, right? But at least it means that you didn't parody it, you didn't treat them with contempt, you didn't twist and distort what they had to say, you didn't cut off pieces of it because that made you uncomfortable. You were at least able to tolerate the information. And I tell you, you get good at that, that'll change your life. You can do that with yourself too, by the way. It's such a useful technique, and it's core to a good therapeutic relationship that you can do that. You listen and listen and listen, and then you say, as far as I can tell, here's the territory you're covering, and this is your point. And that works it just works so well. So I would say, practice that and teach your kids how to do it. And if you have kids that will listen to other people, everywhere they go, people will be happy that they're around. There is nothing that people want more than to be attended to. Nothing. Zero. That's why advertisers pay for your attention. Your attention is the most valuable commodity, period. And if you direct that towards people and their concerns, they are so thrilled about that they're instantly grateful, even though they may be taken aback. So if you can become expert at that, that'll change your whole life and the life of everyone around you. It's an unbelievably useful thing to be able to learn to do. And you can do it. You can start practicing it quite badly. Because you can get it wrong, and even if you hit it, halfway right, the person's still pretty damn happy that you managed it at all, and then they'll help you get better at it. And so you can learn to do that quite effectively. I would say if you practice that for a year, you'd already be pretty damn good at it. And if you practice it for 5 years, it would just become a matter of course. And then you can do it almost immediately when you meet someone. And that's... When you meet someone who puts you at ease, that's essentially what they're doing. They're watching you, and they're attending, and they're matching their behavior to yours, and they're opening themselves up to whatever it is you're communicating. And some people can be so expert at that. Yeah. Oh, I can tell you one more thing about that that's helpful, maybe. Tammy is pretty verbal and pretty assertive, but she's not as verbal or as assertive as me. And that's a problem because she's perceptive in ways that I'm not. Her perceptions are more based on images. They're often manifest in dreams, and they take longer, sometimes a night, especially if the night involves a dream. So it was frequently the case, and I spent a lot of time analyzing dreams. It was frequently the case that Tammy and I would have a conflict, say, before we went to bed. And then I would be up and ready to like have it out and that right now, and she'd think, or tell me, I have to go to sleep. And that was so annoying to me because she'd go to sleep like right now, and I'd be sitting there in bed, stewing away. But if I could manage to leave her be, it was not infrequently the case that she would have a dream that would be very germane to the issue at hand. And that if we discussed it the next day, then it would shed a light on the gist of the problem. And it would sort out for us where change had to take place and with who. And then that would resolve the issue. And one of the things that's great about dreams is they do not lie. Dreams, although they're difficult, see, a dream is a thought, hey? You might say, well, why are dreams hard to understand? And the answer is, well, a dream is a thought that's trying to deal with something you don't understand. And the dream gets you part way to understanding, but not full way. The dream is the birthplace of propositional thought. And so you don't know anything at all to begin with, and then you have a dream. And the dream is part knowledge. It's partly there. And it's not trying to be mysterious, it's just the best that it can do at the moment. And then if you interpret a dream, there are techniques for doing that. If you discuss a dream with someone, sometimes you can further the development of that idea. Just like if you read a novel and discuss it with someone, you understand the novel better. Or if you go to see a movie with someone and then you discuss the movie, you can understand the movie better. It's exactly the same process. So the idea that dream interpretation doesn't work is like, well, how about understanding a movie? Does that work? And how is that different? It's not different. And you can tell if a dream interpretation, it's a weird thing, you can tell if a dream interpretation has a certain degree of accuracy because it clicks. You know, you get an intuition that your understanding and the image are isomorphic in some manner, that they fit. You think, yes, that's right, that's got to the heart of it. And there are techniques for dream interpretation that both Freud and Jung developed, and if you're interested, you could read their writings. And it's complicated to interpret dreams, but it's extremely useful. And so one of the things we also realized was that because Tammy thought differently than I did, often in images, it was also sometimes useful for me to develop her side of the argument, because she would be at a disadvantage on a purely verbal front, and so I could win the argument on verbal grounds, but that didn't mean I was right. And this is something that's really important to understand when you're dealing with other people, is just because you can win the argument does not mean that you're right. And you can't afford to not be right if you don't want to be wrong in relationship to your partner or in relationship to your life. So one of the things you can do, and this is also definitely the case for children, is help scaffold their argument, right? And you also teach them how to present their ideas verbally by doing that, but you want to help them express themselves. You want to help them make their case. And then you teach them how to make their case, but then you also know what their case is, and then maybe you can live in productive peace and harmony instead of having to tyrannize each other. And so that's definitely the case in a marriage, is that you should do what you can to help your partner make their bloody point, because they might be right. And even if they aren't, you have to live with them. So you're going to have to come to some negotiated agreement if you don't want to, because there's 3 conditions of existence: negotiation, tyranny, and slavery. Those are your options. And so if you don't help the other person in their negotiation, if they're not as good at negotiating as you, then they're either going to tyrannize over you or they're going to be your slave. And if that's what you want for your marriage, then, you know, so be it. But I wouldn't recommend it. A negotiated peace that's stable, prosperous, productive, and generous, that's a lot better than tyranny or slavery. So not only might you listen to people, but also, if necessary, you might help them make their argument. And one of the advantages to you is that, imagine you help someone who's an opponent make their argument against you, and you are then forced to develop your thinking to the point where it can withstand that objection, right, or take that objection into account. It means you're way more sophisticated. And then when you encounter a similar opposition in the future, you'll be way more prepared. That's partly why when you go to university, you know, sometimes you might write an essay. You shouldn't do this to please a professor, but you can do it as a voluntary exercise. You might want to write an essay where you flesh out points in opposition to to your thesis. Because the more you explore what opposes you, the more tools you have at hand to deal with what opposes you. And so that's also extremely helpful. And the more you help your partner articulate their concerns, the better you're going to get along. And so there's short-term pain in that because it's complicated and challenging and emotionally difficult. But you don't lie then, and the long-term consequence is that you have, maybe you'll have a household where now and then you actually have peace. And that's something, man. And it's not that common. And it's really something to be somewhere where there's a deep peace, where there aren't skeletons in the closet and snakes under the carpet. And it's rare. And it's really healthy to be in a place like that. It can really help you recover. And there may be a time in your life where you're so sick that if there are skeletons in the closet and snakes under the carpet, you will die. That happens. It could have easily happened to both of us. So, yeah, right.
Do you think that life has become too easy and our society has started creating problems like the gender issue, gender theory, all of the different trans, LGBTQ stuff? Yeah.
I think that people have always, there is very little that you have that's more valuable than your moral reputation. In fact, your moral reputation might be the central economic asset that you possess. Do people trust you? Do they regard you as a good person? Do they regard you as a valid and productive trading partner? Do they want to engage in business endeavors with you? All of that's all dependent on your reputation, your moral reputation. That's the signifier of your interpersonal value. And a tremendous amount of your so-called self-esteem is going to be derived from that. So the problem with that is that because that's the case, people are tempted to falsely inflate their moral standing. And you see that most particularly in the case of narcissists and psychopaths. A psychopath is someone who will pretend to be a good person while doing everything they can to extract resources from you in a non-reciprocal manner. And so what they do is mimic competence. And they mimic competence with a false confidence. So one of the ways we mark competence is by looking for confidence, right? So because we assume that if you know what you're doing, you're going to be quite straightforward when you discuss it and you're not going to be nervous. That's a marker that you're where you should be doing what you know how to do. So we look for confidence. And psychopaths are falsely confident, partly because they don't have much emotion. They don't have much negative emotion. So it's quite easy for them to be falsely confident. And so they can fool people into thinking they're competent, and then they can exploit them. And narcissists do the same thing. But so do people who worship false idols, who adopt an ideological perspective that gives them an instantaneous claim to moral superiority. And so people who elevate their compassion to the highest place do that. You see people who are wired, so to speak, so that if they see a kitten on a plate, in those sort of kitschy representations, they'll say, "Aw," because they have an instant reflexive maternal response, and they think, "I'm such a good person." And because I feel sorry for this kitten on a plate. It's like, no, that is not an indication that you're a good person. It just is an indication that you have a reflexive compassion. But if you presume that your reflexive compassion means you're a good person, then you can inflate your moral capital. And so these ideologies that people are pursuing always doing what they're doing for the good of someone else or for the good of the world, or because they're standing up for the victims. It's all an attempt to falsely inflate their moral worth, their reputation. And you know that in part too because the mobbers use reputation savaging to tear other people apart. So you could say there's a competition of reputations, and you're either compassionate or you're a predator. If you're a predator, then you should be torn into pieces, and if you're compassionate, you're the Virgin Mary herself, and you've won the reputation battle. And I don't think it's any worse now than it ever has been. I think people have been playing those false games forever. It spreads, particular brands of it spread faster now because we can communicate so rapidly. But the temptation to falsely inflate your moral standing has always been there. And then there's another factor which I think is also worth considering, is that since the 1960s, we've built multiple bureaucracies of protest. And we built them increasingly into the structures of our universities. One of the things that really appalled me increasingly as I progressed through my university career, especially in the later years, say from 2010 to 2017, which is essentially when it became impossible for me to be a professor anymore, was that the students were increasingly being explicitly taught to be activists. And I found that appalling. It's like, first of all, what the hell does a 19-year-old know about how the economy should be run sustainably? Like, zero. They can't even manage their finances independently in relationship to their own rent. But the idiot professors are telling them that because they feel sorry for pandas, they understand how the supply chain works. And so, then they're encouraged to, instead of encouraged to learn, yeah, I could say something about the supply chain too, you know. We were compassionate in our response to COVID, hypothetically, so we locked everyone down, and we really disrupted our supply chains. 1 container ship out of 5 right now is trapped in a queue in a port. 20% of the world's capacity to deliver its goods. Okay, the Russians just destroyed one of Ukraine's major exporting terminals. The Russians and the Ukrainians supply about 20% of the world's wheat, more than that, more wheat, but a large percentage of the world's food. We're already seeing massive price spikes in North Africa and the Middle East. There are going to be millions of people starving in the fall. That idiot reflexive compassion that we use to destroy our economic system while we hypothetically fought off COVID because we wanted to keep everyone safe is going to kill millions of people, probably this year. So there's no excuse for this. And there's no excuse anymore for us to be teaching our teenagers that if they feel sorry for kittens, they know something about geopolitical economics. Because those are not the same thing. And it's extraordinarily dangerous when the assumption is made that they are. We see this, it's a religious battle in some sense. We have a new Trinity. We have diversity, inclusivity, and equity. And that's a trinity of compassion. And it's the attempt of the radical types who mostly rely on this shallow compassion, that what they're insisting is that that trinity be put in the highest place. And increasingly, you're required to bow to that trinity by law. And it's extremely destructive. We'll be lucky if it doesn't. We'll be lucky if we can delimit the inevitable suffering that is going to cause to the developing world. So, I need the wording of the question again, so I can tie it back. One person, just one, please. Oh yes, no. So is life becoming too easy? Well, we have a lot of things that we can take for granted. And we don't do a good job of teaching our children how unlikely it is that we can take those things for granted. That we can just get electricity by putting a plug in a wall. That we have this amazing infrastructure around us. And so we're tempted into a kind of false security. And it was that false security that made us arrogant enough to think that we could disrupt our supply chains for 2 years and that there wouldn't be hell to pay, for example. And so in that way, I would say, that's one of the dangers of prosperity, is that you start to assume that it's the norm. And I suppose you people in ex-Soviet countries are less likely to do that because it's been the norm here for a lot less time. But in the West, it is easy, once you're comfortable, to slip into the presumption that that's the norm instead of chaos and catastrophe and strife and starvation and murder and revenge being the norm. So, and I think it's difficult, even if you're a parent who's affluent, it's difficult not to give your children everything, because in some sense, everything they ask for, because you could. You know, if you're above a certain income level and your child asks for a toy in a store, why not say yes, because it isn't going to make any material difference to you. But you know that there's some optimal level of deprivation that's necessary to foster children's development, right? You know that it's not good for you just to get whatever you want the second you want it, even though Amazon is very good at managing that. And we shouldn't take that for granted either. But we don't know exactly how to optimize deprivation so that we're grateful for what we have. And we don't know that as individuals, and we don't know that as a society, because we haven't been contending with the issue of abundance for very long. Even in the developed countries, it's really only been 100 years at the maximum, right? Really, post-World War II in any real sense, and only extremely recently in most countries. So, and then, you know, we've also produced these bureaucracies that were aimed at protest, and that perhaps had their origins in something valid to protest about, but once established were still there and looking for new fodder for their machinery. And the universities have become protest factories in many ways, and as the reason for protest has become more and more minimal by any reasonable standard, the bureaucracy has grown, and so smaller and smaller problems have to be magnified into greater and greater concerns to justify the existence and the expansion of the bureaucracy. You see that with the expansion of DIE, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusivity bureaucracies. The empirical evidence actually suggests, as far as I've been able to tell, that the more money is spent on DEI bureaucracy, the less cohesive and properly functioning the institution becomes. And that wouldn't surprise me in the least. So some of it's bureaucratization of protest, some of it's the temptation into a kind of complacent stasis predicated on abundance. Some of it is personal ignorance. You just have no idea how unlikely it is that things are peaceful and prosperous. And then some of it is this proclivity to claim false moral virtue without putting the effort in that would be required to actually make you a person of stellar and genuine reputation. So.
I have a follow-up question with that, if you don't mind. So you're talking about compassion being, elevated. Where should it be instead, and why has it been elevated there?
Well, it's not exactly straightforward to decide where compassion should be in the hierarchy. It's an element of the divine, let's say, of what should be in the highest place. Imagine a situation in a family, and this is often a dynamic that's played out between mothers and fathers. Mothers are more compassionate by temperament. This is, by the way, part of the reason why almost all the female-dominated disciplines in universities are woke. And that's a big social problem, and it's one that we can barely even talk about. But a big chunk of that is because women are more compassionate by temperament than men. And we assume, clinicians as well, that compassion is a virtue, and the male end of that is a vice, but that's nonsense. It's simply not true. Imagine you have a child. Well, one of our children was very ill. And if you have an ill child, you have a very difficult problem in front of you. Because you don't know, and neither does the child, how much leeway the child should be granted when it's difficult for them to do things. Right? Because, well, you don't even know this with yourself. You wake up in the morning, maybe have a touch of what feels like the flu. Well, should you go to work? Or should you stay in bed? And the answer is, well, maybe you don't know. And so maybe you get up and you try to go to work and you infect 50 people there, and that's a bad decision. Or maybe you stay home and you weren't really that sick, and so that entices you into staying home many times when you shouldn't, and you lose your job. Right? I mean, you can make an error in both directions. You can be too compassionate to yourself, and you can be too strict with yourself. And if you have a sick child, it's a terrible bloody problem, because you want the child to be as adapted and independent as they possibly can be, not least to delimit the catastrophe of the illness, right? Because it's bad enough if you have a sick child that they're sick and they're suffering, but if that's compounded by an unnecessary decrease in their self-confidence and also an inability to make their way forward as a productive and reciprocal social being, then not only are they sick, but the sickness has caused a psychological and a social catastrophe. And obviously that's in no one's best interest. And so then how do you determine how compassionate you should be? And the general answer to that is, the woman errs on the side of compassion, and the man errs on the side of encouragement and limits, and then they fight. And they fight because there isn't any real difference in a situation like that between fighting and thinking. Because this is a hard problem. And part of you, and part of the father, and part of as well, is going to think, oh my God, that poor kid, she's suffering so much that we can't ask any more of her. And we have to accept that. But then the counter-argument is, Jesus, it's rough. Get the hell out of bed and get to school, because it's going to be worse for you if you just stay in bed. I remember one situation with my daughter. She basically walked around on 2 broken legs for a whole year, 2 years. Broken ankle on one leg and a broken hip on the other. She was in a lot of pain, as you might imagine. And she had her hip done. And about 3 weeks later, we decided we would get her a motorcycle, a scooter. 6 weeks? 6 weeks later. And she was pretty excited about that. We were pretty nervous about that because she had fragile bones, and it was a motorcycle. A scooter. It wasn't a huge, powerful motorcycle, but it was a motorcycle, and they're dangerous. But so is not being able to get around. And so she went to motorcycle license training class. You want to tell that story?
Yeah, well, I always thought it would be great to ride a motorbike. And so I went with her, and we took our motorcycle license over a weekend in a big parking lot with some other people. And we were doing all right, and then one of the people who was all dressed in a motorcycle helmet and full gear, he wiped out on his bike, and it was kind of a little bit dramatic. He wasn't hurt, but we went home that night, and the next morning I went to get my daughter out of bed to go and do the next day, and she said she wasn't going to go. She was afraid of what she'd seen the day before, and I said, well, how about if you come there with me? We'll drive there, and we'll see if driving there, on the way there, you change your mind, or if you don't change your mind, it doesn't matter, and we'll just go. And so by the time we got there, she thought maybe she could give it another try, and she did. She dropped her bike once, but she didn't hurt herself. Like, she didn't have any strength to hold it up if it started to go over. So, and everybody was kind of, you know, a little bit feeling like they'd be protective, but everybody didn't interfere, which was great. And I didn't interfere. And we finished, and then we all hung out outside the little college room where they were going to tell us if we passed or not. And when they called my daughter's name, everybody cheered. It was really something, because she'd finally found a way to some freedom so she could get around. I mean, I'd been driving her around for she was like 17, and her mother had to drive her everywhere.
And she couldn't use the subway, because sometimes the subway escalators weren't working, and then she couldn't get up, and so she was really restricted in her mobility, and that was obviously terrible for her. She was a mid-teenager, and she loved that scooter, man. She was on that thing just non-stop.
With her dog,
yeah. It was really good for her. But, you know, that's a good example of, you know, we had to run the conflict between compassion and encouragement, and between accepting someone on the basis of their suffering and encouraging them and pushing them forward. And, you know, we don't exactly know how to do that with ourselves or with anyone else. And so we have to talk about it. And there's a masculine role in that, and there's a feminine role in that. And for us to assume reflexively that only the all-encompassing compassion constitutes the appropriate response is to fall into the nightmare that Freud described as the Oedipal situation, where, you know, you have someone in your family who is just hell-bent on protecting you from every possible danger in the world, and who therefore becomes the biggest danger in the world. And so, and we're playing that out on a massive scale right now in our culture, and we seem completely unable to have a serious discussion about it, because as soon as you bring up the contrary side, which is beware of the devouring, compassionate, all-compassionate spirit, you're very likely to be pilloried as a predator and vilified and taken out. And that's really not good. Carl Jung believed that one way of representing God, so God would be the spirit that was appropriately placed at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of value. So the thing that would be the most appropriate to emulate and imitate. And God ruled with two hands. One was mercy, and so that would be this all-encompassing and accepting compassion. I suppose that in some sense is symbolized by the Virgin Mary in the Christian theological world. But the other is justice and discrimination and differentiation and encouragement. And that discrimination is something. See, Carl Rogers said that a therapist should have unconditional positive regard for his or her clients. And I never believed that. I thought that was incautiously formulated on his part. And observers of Rogers noted quite soon after he formulated that proposition that that wasn't how he acted. And that was because he was wiser than he knew. When you're a therapist, what you do a lot of judgment. A lot. Because what you're trying to do is to find the part of the person that's the part that they want to be, that they need to be. You know, a confident part, a competent part, a part that can transcend the suffering, a part that can develop further, a part that isn't self-punitive, a part that isn't vengeful. You want to help the person differentiate between the part of them that's driving down and the part that's driving upward. And that requires continual judgment, not merely an indiscriminate acceptance. That indiscriminate acceptance, especially in someone who's suffering, is very, very damaging because it doesn't help them separate the wheat from the chaff. And there's a lot more chaff than there is wheat. And we all have to use discriminating judgment on ourselves to identify the parts that need to be dispensed with, which is often a lot of us, and to facilitate the development of the parts that are striving upwards towards the light, and to encourage that part at the expense, literally, the expense of all that dead wood that should be burned off and left behind. And so, whatever should be in the highest place is something like the negotiated solution between mercy and justice. That's still an oversimplification, but it's a more sophisticated representation of the uppermost spirit than the mere unconscious, all-encompassing maternality. The only time that's useful is when you're dealing with an infant who's younger than 6 months old. And that's a really challenging thing to do because infants are born fetal. For a mammal of our size, on average, should have a gestation period of 2 years. So that's partly why many animals are so much more able than our babies when they're first born. You know, a fawn can stand up pretty much immediately after birth, whereas it takes a child like 18 months to get to that point. And so human infants are extremely dependent. And what that means is that the only proper attitude to have to an infant under 6 months, any infant that isn't capable of some autonomous movement, the only response is, everything you do is right, every need you have should be taken care of, everything that threatens you is a predator, and all of your desires are to be met as rapidly as possible with no argument. But after 9 months, that is not a useful strategy. And it becomes increasingly less useful as the child matures. And it is definitely not a good strategy to use with adult males. And it is definitely not a strategy that we can predicate our larger social institutions upon. There's no evidence whatsoever that that strategy can form the basis for sustainable and productive social institutions, all the way from marriage up to the state. And we have to stop deluding ourselves into thinking that that's the case, because everything is not an infant, and everyone is not an infant, and you confuse the world and other people with infants at your peril and theirs. So I guess that's the answer to that question. One more, and I have to make it short, which I probably can't, but I'll try.
Well, hello, Jordan. Have you ever read any Serbian writers?
That is going to be short. I don't know. Most of the writers I read, I don't classify by nationality. Sometimes I know the nationality, obviously, with writers like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. I've read a lot of literature. I don't know if I've read anything specifically Serbian. So...
Here's another question.
Okay.
How do you distinguish self-sabotage from reasonable doubt?
Okay, that's a good one. I think I can answer that in a fairly short period of time. How do you distinguish self-sabotage from reasonable doubt? Imagine you have a child, and you set extremely high standards for that child. And you might say, well, you should set extremely high standards for your child. And that's true, you should set high standards for your child. The question is, how high? So imagine that you set standards so high that your child always comes up short. Okay, that's just not a good game. A game where the person cannot win no matter how hard they try. First of all, it's pretty likely that you're playing a game of moral superiority with your child, right? I have such high standards that nothing you do can possibly satisfy someone like me. It's a very nasty game. So, but then imagine that everything your child does is an indication that they're Nikola Tesla, right? Everything they do is a manifestation of their utter genius. Well, that's obviously wrong too. So there's an error over here, and there's an error over here, and the question is, how do you calibrate the optimal middle? And the answer is something like, you want to situate your child in a place that Vygotsky, Russian developmental psychologist, called the zone of proximal development. And children will do this to themselves automatically. We got my daughter a play set when she was about 3, and part of it was 2 ladders with a ladder across the top, and she could climb up to the first ladder, and it was pretty high for a 3-year-old, about 8 feet, I would say. And we watched her when we first set it up, and she would stand, she'd grab the ladder rungs, and then she'd move her foot up like this, and then like this, and then like this, and then put her foot on the first rung, and then she'd move this foot like this, and then like this, and then like this, up on the first rung, and what she was doing was pushing herself slightly outside of her zone of comfort with each move forward in relationship to the goal, and challenging herself optimally. So it was exciting enough to be engaging, but not so unsettling that it was terrifying. And that's sort of what you want for your life, right? You want it to be unsettling enough so it's interesting, but not so overwhelming that it's terrifying. And if you find that balance precisely, then you experience what you're doing as meaningful. That's what the instinct of meaning signifies, is that you're in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing in a way that will expand your ability to do that even more in the future. And that's a meaningful thing to do. And it's so important to find that place that you have, the deepest instinct you have signifies that occurrence. That's what you want to do with yourself. So it's self-sabotage if you set yourself impossible goals. And if you're a tyrant to yourself, you're always demanding so much of yourself that you're never satisfied, and in principle you can't be. That's not acceptable. But then if you let yourself off the hook for everything, well, you're going to become nihilistic and unhappy and dwarfed with, drowned in self-contempt very rapidly. That's no good either. That's too much chaos, and that high demand is too much order. You want to find something in the middle where you're pushing yourself enough to be really engaged with what you're doing, but you're setting standards that are reasonable enough so that if you stretch yourself in a sustainable way, if you stretch yourself, there's a reasonable probability that you'll succeed. And then I would say, well, if you find yourself not succeeding, well, what do you do? And the answer is, make smaller goals. You just shrink the goals until you succeed. And it's not just an arbitrary game, it's a form of calibration, right? You want to reward yourself. This is why a rule in my first book was compare yourself with who you were yesterday rather than with who someone else is today. It's like you can take yourself as a baseline with all your inadequacies, and you can say, well, my goal is to be 1% better at one of the things I do tomorrow. And that's a compounding pathway. If you start doing that, you improve extremely rapidly. But you have to get the balance right. It has to be, well, you have to do better, but not so much better that you can't do it. And you can experiment with that. And so one of the things you do as a therapist, if you're a behavior therapist, is you engage with your client in a process called collaborative empiricism. So for example, maybe you have a client who's not very conscientious and who gets out of bed somewhere between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. And they know perfectly well they're wasting their lives, right? 2 and 4, so it's too late and it's too erratic. And so you talk that through and you come to a mutual agreement. They have to be on board for this, or even have thought it up themselves. You cannot oppose this. You have to investigate, and just like you have to do with yourself. You cannot force yourself to do things, or it's very difficult. You have to ask yourself what you're willing to do and negotiate. So maybe you say, well, why don't we try to constrain your wake time to an hour? So instead of getting up between 2 and 4, you get up between 2 and 3. And maybe we'll try that for a week. Because we don't know, well, you've been like this for 10 years, let's say, how fast can you change? Because you might say, well, why the hell don't you just start getting up at 7 in the morning? And the answer is something like, well, I haven't for 10 years, so it seems like I don't. Well, how fast will I change? Who knows? Let's find out. Go home for a week, set alarm for 2 and set alarm for 3. See if you can get up regularly between 2 and 3, and then keep track of how many days you manage that. And then come back and let's talk. And maybe the person comes back and says, oh man, it was no problem. I got up at the first alarm each day. It was way easier than I thought it would be. And then you think, great, we're on the right track and we can probably accelerate the intervention. Or the person comes back and says, oh my God, it was a complete disaster. You know, I shut the bloody alarm off at 2 and then I shut it off at 3. And then I just slept till 5. It was like, you know, up yours. I'm not getting up at all. If that's the way you're going to be. And so then that's a different problem. You have to, obviously, what that is the manifestation of a resistance, psychologically, psychoanalytically speaking. You tapped into something that's elicited an immature response on the part of the person, for one reason or another, an immature, defensive, and passive-aggressive response, and you might have to delve into that and figure out why that's happening, and do something on the collaborative empiricism front to address that. Complicated. Sometimes dream analysis can be very helpful in unlocking such things. With the person who's successful, you might say, oh, well, let's set it back an hour this week and see if that works. And if that works, the next week maybe you can set it back 2 hours. And so what you have to do is you have to experiment with yourself. You know, and you can start by working on those things. I always think you want to find something that you know you should change, that you would change. And there's lots of things that you should change that you won't change. And you can tell that because you haven't changed them. But there's some things that you're doing that aren't good for you, that you know, that you probably would change. And you can sit down and ask yourself, like you'd ask someone else, okay, what stupid thing am I doing? And then you'll have memories that are associated with that. And then you'll think, okay, is there some of that that I would stop? And then you can try stopping and see what happens. And you have to play with yourself in that way to see what you're willing to do. And you also have to find, you know, one of the things I also worked out with my clients is, well, maybe you need a reward. You know, maybe if you, maybe I ask them, what do you really like doing? Well, I really like listening to music, or I really like watching some television show, or whatever, I don't care. I like to go have a cappuccino. Who cares? Something you like. Well, maybe what you do when you decide that you're going to do something that you should do, that you would do, and then you go do it, is to give yourself a little reward. And maybe you do that with people that you're negotiating with too, you know, it's like, because you want to find out how to incentivize people, and you can really start by doing that with yourself. You have a nature, you know, you have to be contended with, you have to be negotiated with, and you can find out how to entice yourself along a desirable path. But you have to understand that you're not something that you can exercise tyrannical control over. And it's because in some sense you have an autonomous soul. You are a certain creature, and you're not subject to your own tyranny, as you perfectly know, because you can't tell yourself what to do. You know, it just doesn't, very seldom works. You'll resist in all sorts of ways. But you can negotiate with yourself and entice yourself and reward yourself. And you can learn how to do that. And then, having learned how to do that with yourself, you can start doing that with other people. And that's so insanely productive. You know, I like generally, if I'm interacting with people, if we have a formal agreement, a business agreement, I don't look for compromise on an agreement. I said, look, if we're going to work together, I want you to offer me a proposal that you're absolutely thrilled with, that couldn't be better as far as you're concerned. Now, I don't know if I can accept that because I'm looking for the same solution for myself. And so you may not get 100% of what you're asking for, although we'll maybe be able to negotiate another solution. But what I want from you is I want you to be thrilled. I don't want you to compromise. This isn't a zero-sum game. I want us, and it's the same in your marriage, hopefully. It's like you're not trying to meet each other halfway. You're trying to figure out a way you can be jointly thrilled. And now, obviously, you can't always do that, and you have to settle for what the circumstances allow. You know, sometimes there are tight constraints. But lots of the time, you can have it. You can have your cake and eat it too if you are careful in your negotiations. And when you negotiate with yourself, well, here's something that's really worth thinking through. So there's the gospel statement. It's a very strange one. Knock and the door will open. Ask and you will receive. Seek and you will find. And you think, well, there's no way that can be true. And actually, it's true. But it really means that you have to ask and seek and knock. This is no game. This will not work if it's a game. You have to ask yourself, you can ask yourself, given how miserable and tragic my life is, what would it have to look like in order for me to be thrilled to be alive? And then you have to ask yourself that. Like, it's the most serious question that you can ask yourself, which it is. What is it that you would need and want in order to justify to yourself the catastrophe of your life? And you know, you can think, well, what do you have? What might you have going for you? Well, how about you have someone who really loves you, like an intimate partner, and that's going great? Well, people seem to find a lot of satisfaction in that and a lot of comfort in tragedy in that. And so you have a great relationship. You think, well, that would be worth a fair bit of suffering. It's like, okay, so what would that look like if I had a great relationship? You have to get a vision of that, you know? And maybe you look at the great relationships that you've seen, or even the glimpses of good relationships. You try to amalgamate that into your life. And maybe you negotiate that with your partner. And then you think, well, I could have a relationship with my children, or my siblings, or my parents. And I'd really like to have a good relationship with my father and my mother. One of the things Tammy did was she did this article. You could talk about this for a second. Tammy finished one of the programs I developed called the Future Authoring Program, and one of the goals she set, because one of the goals categories is remediation of family relationships, I decided to
improve the relationship I had with my father. I don't know if Mom was sick by then, but my mom had dementia. And she might have been starting to have trouble. I'm sure she was. She was starting to have trouble. And I'd always had a pretty good relationship. I could speak freely with my mom. But my dad and I really didn't. It's not that we didn't talk. We weren't close. As close as we might have been. And so I wrote down on my goal that I'd like to improve my relationship with my father. And I was surprised at how, because you know, when you write down the goal, you write down how long this should take,
why you're doing
it, what you're willing to do, how you think it could be improved, and so you expand on this, and I'm sure it was within that year, my relationship was much better with my dad.
Yeah, and it got way better. I mean, your relationship with your dad got really good. He really trusts you, and he really respects and admires you in a way that wasn't the case before you did that. Like, it's a lovely thing to see, and it was a great thing, you know, because at the same time, Tammy's mother was dying in a very terrible way, and so that was a complete loss for the family. But Tammy cemented her relationship with her father, and that gave her something genuine. I wouldn't say as a replacement for what she had with her mother, but at least as it was something in the same domain of similar value. It wasn't nothing. And one of the things that was so lovely about Tammy's family was that when her mother was dying, instead of that tearing them apart, which can often happen, the family really came together, and many family members attempted to iron out some of the kinks in the relationships. And so by the time your mother died, the rest of your family was closer. And that went a long way to healing the wound, I would say. And that continued afterwards as well. It has continued over many years and has made many things. I mean, for example, Tammy's sister now has dementia, and she's quite a young woman as well. She's in her 60s, but young, you know, way too young for that. Maybe that's always the case. But we've been able to negotiate with Tammy's other sister, who's taking care of her. We've been able to negotiate her care quite transparently, I would say, and without rancor. And part of that was definitely a consequence of you working consciously to repair your relationships with your siblings and your father. And it really worked. And one of the things that's been lovely about traveling for me and doing this sort of thing is that many people have come up to me and said, and this is especially true of young men, but it happens with young women too. They said that they really put an effort into repairing the relationship with their brother or with their father, and that really worked. And sometimes it's a son and a father who are together and say that, and they're both like beaming away. You know, it's so great. It's so great. And so you can do this with yourself. You know, you can take the catastrophe of your life seriously. You can take your nihilism seriously. You say, well, look, life is miserable and difficult and full of betrayal and malevolence, and why bloody bother? And that can make you cynical, because the answer to that could be, yeah, why bother in the face of all that misery? But it could be posed as a question, which is, well, why bother then? And the answer might be, well, because I can have someone to love, or many people, and I can do something productive and generous, and I can have an adventure, and like, I don't know what it would be, or I can discover something, or I can engage in some creative activity. I don't know. Or I can find people to care for, or people to compete with, depending on your temperament. You can find out from yourself. You can ask yourself, well, under what conditions would the adventure of my life justify its suffering? And then out of that question can arise a vision, and then that vision, that's your adventure, and hopefully your destiny. And you can make that a reality. And then you have an antidote to catastrophe and tyranny. And it's real. It's not some illusion. It's the real thing. And so that's what you should do, as far as I'm concerned.